In this video, I'm going to be continuing my journey to find the perfect YouTube studio camera, this time looking at the Sony a7S III. Here's the story. The Sony a7S III has a full-frame 12.1 megapixel back-illuminated CMOS sensor. It shoots up to 4K 120p and has 10-bit 422 color sampling, and it has no recording limit for video. It has a fast hybrid autofocus system with 759 phase detection points. It can do 16-bit RAW external recording, 15 stops of dynamic range, in-body image stabilization, 2 dual-function media card slots for SD and CF Express Type A cards, a full HDMI out, a QXGA 9,437,184 dot OLED EVF, a very-angled touch LCD screen with 1,440,000 dots, and USB-C, which can run video out to a computer or power and charge the camera. And this is my current YouTube studio camera setup. Currently, I'm recording with the Sony 35mm f1.8, and I really like the look that it gives in this studio space. It's not too wide and it's also not too tight, and if I really want to get that separation between myself and the background, I can do that. Right now I'm set at an f7.1, but let's change it to a f1.8. And now this is what it looks like at an f1.8, and it really does knock out the background. You can't even read the number that's on the Lumetric time unit in the background. So that's why I typically like to have a bit of a deeper depth of field, but if you really do like that shallow depth of field look, you can definitely do that on this camera with the full frame sensor and the Sony 35mm f1.8. Now, there are a few key things that I look for in the perfect YouTube studio camera, and the very first thing is reliable autofocus. So right now I've got the camera set up to have eye detect autofocus, and this is really handy because all I need to do is hit record on the camera, make sure that it's framed correctly, and then I don't have to worry about the focus if I'm sitting a little bit too close or a little bit too far back. The camera will automatically track my focus and I will be in focus the entire time. With other cameras that don't have such reliable autofocus, I have found at some stages, especially when using manual lenses and there's no continuous autofocus at all, that I could record a full video and the content could be great, I nailed all my points, and then when I look at the footage, I see that the focus is just a little bit off, and that's user error, and that's on me, and I acknowledge that. But then for the video to be at a quality that I'm happy for it to be usable, I really need to be in focus. So having reliable autofocus where you don't have to worry about fiddling with the focus before hitting record is something that I really look for in a YouTube studio camera. And I do stress it does need to be reliable. There are cameras out there that do have continuous autofocus, but it isn't really reliable. And I'm sure you've seen the videos on YouTube. People are talking to camera and then the camera starts to focus on the background and then focuses back on the face. And for me, it's really distracting seeing that, and I don't want to see that in my videos. With my experience with the a7S III, I haven't seen any problems with these types of videos. I haven't seen it hunting on the background and then coming back to my face. It's been locked onto my face the entire time, and I know that I'm in focus the whole time during the video. Another big thing I look for in YouTube studio cameras is no recording limit for video. Other camera companies like Canon are notorious for having a 30-minute record time limit on their DSLR or mirrorless cameras. With the Sony a7S III, there's no record time limit. So if you're talking for an extended period of time, so over 30 minutes, maybe even up to an hour, you know that the entire time you are going to be recorded, and halfway through whatever you're talking about, the camera's not just going to cut off. So that is something that is really important, and especially if you're doing live streams as well. You don't want the camera to be cutting off, turning off, or anything like that. You want it to be powered on the entire time, recording the entire time, and giving you an image so you don't then have those embarrassing moments where the camera feed cuts to black or something like that. I also record my videos in 4K 25p, and obviously this camera can do it because it can do up to 4K 120p, which is obviously more than enough for these YouTube videos. And having this extra feature might be beneficial for you because you could then use the 120p to record B-roll, and if you like that slow motion look, you can then slow it down in your editing program and get those nice smooth looking slow motion shots. However, if you're just talking to camera like I am right now, you might not need that function, but it is good to know that it is there. This camera also has an HDMI out, which is the Type A port, and it also allows you to get a clean feed out of your camera as well. So you don't have any of your display info showing up on your footage. You're able to record your footage from this camera to an external device like a Ninja 5, or be able to pipe it into your computer and use it as a live stream device that way as well, and not have to worry about having extra focusing points showing up on the screen or any of the other display info as well. It's a nice clean feed and the way it should look. This camera also has a very angled LCD touchscreen as well, so you can turn the screen around and be able to see what you look like when you're sitting in front of it, which is very handy. Not all cameras have this. Some of them have a fixed screen or only the ability to be able to tilt the screen from behind. And if you're in front of the camera, you then can't see what your image looks like. So then you'd need an external recorder on top of that or an external monitor on top of that to be able to see what your frame actually looks like. But with this camera, it comes with a tilt out screen, which allows you to be able to sit in front of the camera and be able to see what your framing looks like before you hit record. I also really like the image that comes out of the Sony a7S III. It does have a few different picture profiles that you can choose from. The main ones that I use are S-Log3 and S-Cinetone, which is picture profile 8 and picture profile 11. And to be able to use picture profile 11, you might need to do a firmware update depending on when you've purchased this camera. And I really like using the S-Cinetone picture profile. I think the picture profile looks great and it really does speed up my post-editing process. Instead of needing to go through and adding extra filters and color correct, which is notorious for working with log footage, all I need to do is import the footage into my editing program, and then if I really want to, I can make some minor corrections. So a lot of the recent in-studio shots where I'm talking to camera has been shot on the Sony a7S III and in S-Cinetone, and I haven't actually touched the color correcting tools in Final Cut. The majority of that footage has been straight out of camera. And I really appreciate how this can speed up my workflow. With these YouTube videos, I don't want to be spending a lot of time in the editing process. If I can find little things that speed up my workflow, I'll most of the time embrace those and not try to look for ways to create more work for myself as opposed to making things more efficient. And I find that S-Cinetone really does make my post-editing workflow a lot more efficient. This camera also has a variety of codecs that you can use as well, depending on how beefy your computer is, how much data you want to have as well in your files. And if you're wondering, for these YouTube videos, I use the XAVC-S 4K 25p 140M 422 10-bit codec with S-Cinetone. You also have the ability to attach extra microphones to this camera. So if you want to record audio directly into the camera, you can do that through the MI Shoe. There's also a mic jack, which accepts 3.5mm inputs as well. So you don't need to purchase an extra adapter as well if you've got a microphone that fits into that. But if you have XLR inputs and you want to be able to run those straight into the camera, then you will need to pick up that extra module, which Sony does. And this again can also help speed up your workflow as well. If you don't want to be recording audio to an external device and then syncing in post, this is a good way to eliminate that extra step in post. And also, if you're a streamer and want to be able to use this camera, you can do that. And Sony has an app which allows you to be able to register the a7S III through your computer as a webcam. And you're able to do this through the USB port on your computer. The app is called Imaging Edge Webcam, and there's a link in the description if you're interested in downloading it. However, if you are an Apple M1 owner currently, this app does not work with the M1 silicon chip, unfortunately. This was a big disappointment to me as an M1 Mac Mini user. So if I did want to use this camera as a webcam, I'd then have to purchase an extra piece of equipment like the Elgato Cam Link, and then I'd be able to use this camera that way. And with all that said, the Sony a7S III is a very good camera for YouTube studio creation. However, there are a few things that this camera misses that I'd really like to see. The first thing is waveform. And I really like using waveform to get the correct exposure for my shots. And I was really surprised when I first discovered that the a7S III didn't have waveform, because on previous cameras that I'd used, like the Panasonic S1, waveform was included. So the a7S III not having waveform is something that was a bit of a letdown for me. And it also doesn't have shutter angle. And that's just another way of calculating your shutter. Typically in a space like this, I would use a 1/50 shutter. However, if I was using shutter angle, I would use a 180-degree shutter. And once again, that's another feature that I had on a previous camera, but isn't on this camera, and something I got used to. But once you get used to it, it's not really a deal breaker. It's just something to be aware of. And another thing this camera doesn't let you do is import LUTs. So if you're shooting in S-Log3 and then you want to import a LUT that you normally use in your editing program, then you can't do that for this camera, unfortunately. If you're wanting to monitor your footage while you're recording and you're shooting in S-Log3, you're going to need to use an external recorder or monitor to be able to see what it will look like in the editing program. This is another thing to be aware of if you're a live streamer as well and you like to shoot in S-Log3. However, in some streaming apps like OBS, which is the one that I use, there is an option to be able to apply a LUT to your footage. So that's another limitation and also a workaround that you should be aware of. And the last thing that I wish this camera had, which I don't think any camera has, is the ability to record 32-bit float audio. This is something that I use with my MixPre 3 Mark II, and it can definitely be a lifesaver when recording something and wanting to be able to make sure that you don't get any clipped audio. If for whatever reason, when you're recording in 32-bit float, the audio seems to be distorted, this isn't actually the case when you bring it into your editing program. You're able to then bring the levels back down, and then all of a sudden, the crunchy distorted audio that you did have, all of a sudden becomes usable once again. And this is a feature that once you've used it, you can't go back. So that's definitely something that I'd love to see in future cameras. I'm not expecting it to come this year or next year, but it's definitely a feature that I'd like to see in the future. For me, it's a really helpful feature, and it also helps cut down on extra gear that I'd need to have during my shoots. So overall, is the Sony a7S III the perfect YouTube studio camera? Well, yes, for right now. As I mentioned, there are a few things that this camera doesn't have, and there are workarounds, or I can just get by without those features, but it would really be nice to have a camera that does include waveform, does include shutter angle, and being able to import LUTs directly into the camera, and also have that 32-bit float audio recording capability. Also, depending on your budget, this camera might be seen as a little extra. At $3,500 US, this is a significant investment, and that's just for the camera body itself. It doesn't include lenses, memory cards, extra batteries, and all that kind of extra stuff that you need to be able to use the camera properly. There are cheaper options like the Sony a6400, and it's cheaper because it does cut down on some of the bells and whistles that this camera has. So you can't shoot 4K 120p in 10-bit, but you might find that that camera fits all the needs that you have for a YouTube studio camera. And that's the video. I hope you found it helpful, and if you did, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel for more videos on video creation in the future.